Hi.
Hello. Hey, Alice. Welcome to the X Factor podcast. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you again, Charles. Happy to be here.
Yes. So to back up, you are, and I am Charles Epstein. You are Alice Dawson. This is what number podcast? Or is this our second or third?
This is our second one so
This is
far.
our second. I'm getting ahead of ourselves because we do have several others planned. And let me just give you a brief introduction for the benefit of our listeners. Uh, Alice, you are one, let me just say, you are one of our regular, semi regular co hosts. Alice is a senior coordinator at Chestnut Health Systems Lighthouse Institute. She's a contracted LLM training specialist and red teamer and brings a background of over 10 years of academic, clinical, and behavioral research to this pod. And she joins me today outside of Princeton, New Jersey. Really nice to see you. How's the weather up there? I have to ask, down here, it is absolutely optimal weather. So I've made a theme of my last handful of podcasts to begin with the weather, because this is the period of the year when it's really, really great to be down here and I could, express an appropriate level of schadenfreude, particularly when I'm speaking to people up north. So please tell me how chilly and unbearable it is. It'll make me very happy.
Oh, Charles, you are killing me. I would love to snowbird down south. There is at least 6 to 8 inches of snow right now, and it hasn't been above 32 in at least a few days. So
Music,
it's not great.
music, music to my ears. Um, yes, well, previous podcast, I spoke with Michelle Strasburger with HR Rebooted, and she's up in New Hampshire. Time we spoke, I believe, if memory serves, it was in the negative teens.
Oof.
And I can't imagine walking outside your office, your house, that kind of weather. In any case, really looking forward to today's conversation. This could be a really, really good one. It's so funny. Before we get to it, I was talking to somebody recently, and I was just sort of teasing. The both of us, person I was speaking to, have the same general genre as far as our hair color goes. And I said, my goal is to actually have on the podcast the broadest representation of hair color as possible, from gray or grayish to brunette, everywhere in between. And I think it's safe to say that your hair color, although the previous time you were on, I think it was green. Yes? No?
Was it?
I think so. I think
You know,
so.
I
If it
change it a lot. I have
was
fun with
green
it.
part of the palette? Was green
Green's
within
been
the
I've done
range?
all of them, so it's really it
Okay,
does
so I'm not
blur.
inventing that. So there's a good possibility. We have to go back to
We'll have to check.
yeah, we have to go back. So pink, purple, how would you exactly describe?
Yeah, I'd call it a pink into purple ombre right now. I definitely change it frequently because,
What's
um,
frequently? Every third day, every fifth day, every
oh
week?
gosh, no, when it starts to fade in a month or 2, I'll, switch it out.
Okay. All right. Well, don't want to get too down. This
Let's not
people
get
will
too
start
rabbit
thinking,
hole.
yeah, people will start thinking we're going to get into hair products and so forth. That's not a conversation I
Not
want to
today.
have. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Anyway, thanks for joining me. I really do appreciate it. Last time I had you on, I mentioned how tiresome I find the line, AI won't take your job. The person with AI will, and we agreed that it's more about who's going to be using AI more effectively? Because let's face it, AI is pretty ubiquitous, and it's really how you're going to be able to use it effectively to not necessarily replace critical thinking, but to sharpen it, not to replace creativity, but to spark it, and how it could be used productively within teams to collaborate.
Yeah.
So, I kind of want to get into that conversation today and specifically talk about your research and findings on Gen A's impact on work. Again, how people use it to think creatively, critically, collaboratively. So, um, I just want to take a step back and ask you a really more fundamental question. What separates from what you've seen in the literature, from what you've experienced when you're out there, as far as the things that separates an effective user from an ineffective user of Gen AI?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that fundamentally, the finding across research is that ineffective users of AI are those who are using these tools passively. I like to think of it as these folks are the ones who treat it like an expert Google search or a omnipotent Ask Jeeves, if you will, if
Uh,
you can do a throwback. It's minimal critical thinking involved, more time having to finagle responses, and less review of outputs, and really just less active engagement. So then you have your active users, and these are the ones that are going to be more effective because these are ones who do prompt engineering, who are thinking critically about their biases and also reflecting on the outputs from the AI for their reliability, their validity, those sorts of things. And so I like to think of these active users more like wielding Gen AI as a tool, like they're a skilled outdoorsman with a Swiss Army knife that
mm.
they know how to use properly and which tools when. And so those I think is really the big difference between effective and ineffective use is whether or not you are actively engaging in the process in a back and forth.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. It sort of reminds me of the distinction that Marshall McLuhan, to invoke uh, um, a bygone name, when he made the distinction between a hot medium and a cold. When a hot is where there's just a lot of information thrust on you and you don't really bring a lot to it. Cool medium cold is one where you need to invest more of yourself. So it sort of is that same thing, passive as opposed to active. Obviously, a cool medium requires more active engagement. So it's kind of interesting, those parallels. And now that's a really good way of framing the conversation because that dual or that dichotomy really does manifest itself, excuse me, in all the types of thinking that we're about to discuss. So, yeah, I've read a lot about Gen AI and critical thinking, how we tend to use it to take on the cognitive load, which is to say, do more of our critical thinking. So, how can AI be used to actually sharpen rather than supplant critical thinking?
So there's a lot of research being done in this area. And when you talk about it taking on the cognitive load, there's sort of two questions here. So, what happens with this cognitive offloading, right, and passive use? And then how can we help people, or how can we get users to be more critically thinking and more active users of AI? So, first, to start with the cognitive offloading, there was a big study that came out earlier this year from Dr. Hankley at Carnegie Mellon, as well as researchers at Microsoft. And what they found is that users felt that they were putting in less cognitive effort. They were doing more cognitive offloading when using Gen AI compared to not, but specifically across all levels of complication of task, all levels of complexity, or all what we would call levels of comprehension or learning. So, pulling from education research, this would be called Bloom's taxonomy. So, there's 5 levels of relating to or engaging with information. And so, the first one would be memory recall, rote memory recall. So we're going to go with the example of a car, right? So being able to say, that's a car. I know what a car is. I could tell you what a car is versus a truck. That's baseline types of tasks and knowledge, right? Then you move on to understanding. What are cars used for? How do cars work? Something like that. And then the third phase is application, driving a car or fixing basic issues on a car. Then you're at the level of knowledge where you're actually able to apply the knowledge. Okay. And then there's the fourth level. And this is where critical thinking starts to become important is analysis and evaluation. So that's when you're able to take in knowledge or information about a field specific topic and analyze it critically in a way that is useful and effective. And so you have to know, for example, for the car example, this would be someone who gets a car that has some complex issue that they don't understand, it's odd, and they are able to figure out and uh, find the root cause of that problem because of their depth of understanding. And the final level here is what you have of novelty, creation. This is the highest level of knowledge or information in a field, is where you are innovating, right? This is where creativity comes in specifically as well. This is coming up with new fuel efficient car, engines or something like that, trying to improve upon existing issues or improve upon rather existing technologies, things like that. And so what they found in the research is that looking at Bloom's taxonomy and what types of tasks that knowledge workers are doing, they are equally using Gen AI to cognitively offload at all of these levels. And that's a little bit alarming
Sure.
because when it comes to tasks that are critical analysis and things like that, you really need field specific knowledge and that human oversight. And so it's pretty alarming what those findings were. And so this really becomes an issue when that higher order thinking that requires that nuance understanding and domain specific knowledge is offloaded onto a system, because then you just open up a whole can of worms for inaccuracy and things like that. And
Right.
in fact, one author wrote a follow-up paper warning of the dangers of if, let's say, AI became complicit in de-skilling users of AI.
Interesting.
Sort of a scary thought.
Interesting.
um
Interesting.
yeah.
I think there was sort of two dimensions to this. Number one, as far as critical thinking, to go in aware that it can be a little bit of a trap, and you don't want to rely on AI to do too much critical thinking because it doesn't have, at least right now, that domain specific information. It does still, to some degree, it's getting better, but it still does hallucinate. So you can't entirely rely on it. And also, I wrote a piece in X Files recently talking essentially about how you really need to be careful how you formulate a prompt, because if you're not careful, AI is going to give you an opinion rather than a consensus, or something that's more fact based. It's going to sort of assert a certain personality, which is sort of a weird thing. So that's
Exactly.
one dimension. But the other dimension, so that's sort of defensive, being critical of what AI is doing as far as the critical thinking process. The second piece is, how can AI be used to actually sharpen your critical thinking? So one is actually being mindful of some of the pitfalls. The other one is like, okay, here are its strengths. I want to use it to stress test ideas.
Right. Yeah. And so thankfully, a lot of the same types of things that we know can be used to improve critical thinking for people in general can be applied to AI, but one of the most important concepts that comes to mind for me is the idea of using metacognitive strategies. And this is so to break that down, metacognitive or metacognition is thinking about thinking. And so metacognitive strategies basically are taking the time to mindfully consider what you are, let's say, putting into an AI prompt as you are doing it. It's you're considering your biases, you're considering your
Oh,
process as you're doing it. So
and
not
it
only are you
and
critically thinking about the info, but you're also critically thinking about your process.
I see, and I'm assuming that leads to a sharper prompt, which in and of itself is a process of critical thinking.
Absolutely. And it also reduces that some of that back and forth of trying to refine it to get it what you want because you're
Right.
coming in with the knowledge of what your end goal
Yeah,
is,
no, that's
and
absolutely the case. I mean, because you find that I think the initial tendency in interacting with any of these LLM is to be fairly general and vague and see what comes back. But you do over time realize the more precise the prompt is, which obviously requires a lot of very careful, critical thinking, the better and more refined the output's going to be. So,
yeah,
so that I understand. Any thoughts on, or are there any kind of exercises, any ways that people are using it to sharpen the critical thinking? Yeah, I understand the cognitive piece
yeah,
of it as we're talking now, but how else can it actually sharpen? You could perhaps in sort of an iterative kind of a way in the way you interact
sure.
with it.
Yeah, and I think, you know, things like and some of this might be repeat for the readers of AIX files, but things like using it as a sparring partner or debate partner or alternating on sessions and off sessions with Gen AI in your work, having it asking it to point out your own flaws in your reasoning or asking it to, point out limitations and things like that, can really help one be able to develop those skills so that they can
Right.
even start to do that same thing on their own.
Yeah, this is, we know that some of these things have the issue of sycophancy, but in a weird
Yes.
way, that could be viewed as sort of agreeableness. Because how many times have you put up a prompt and then you come back and, well, not quite, and you try to refine it and get it more refined. So in a way, that is that iterative process. And while you may get back, brilliant question, Alice, still, it's engaging you and it's thinking and it's going to come back with its best effort at a response.
Yeah, exactly. And so really it's then that's where back to the metacognitive strategies comes because that's where you're thinking about, okay, how am I framing this question to make sure it's not being a sycophantic parrot and just giving me an opinion or just suggesting that whatever I'm asking obviously is an amazing question, right? Things like that. And
Right.
so, yeah, things like that. Asking for pushback. And really, I think Gen AI is more better equipped to facilitate speed of productivity, not necessarily quality. So it's the conscious attention in doing so that makes the difference and just
Yeah, yeah,
active use, really.
yeah, like all of a sudden saying, "Okay, I want you to be devil's advocate and give me pushback." So you can direct it to have that kind of interaction and so produce again a sharper response as you go through that interaction. So, um
Absolutely.
I do want to get to creativity and I do want to get to the collaborative uh thinking. What do we do next? Creativity or collaborative thinking? What do you want to talk
Let's
about?
talk a little bit about creativity because I think this idea of how we can use it for improving critical thinking is a good segue into talking about creativity specifically because there is a difference between critical thinking and creativity, right?
Right.
These are two different skills. And some people may argue that creativity is something that you're born with or not. the research would suggest otherwise, that you can learn to be more creative. So when we talk about AI and creativity, um, we're I really want to first pull back and provide the caveat, I think, that creativity is a really tricky area because by its nature, creativity is messy and meandering, and productivity is focused on achieving the most perfect outcomes. And so when it comes to I just like to remind people that many of, in fact, if not all of some of the most innovative thinkers in history will claim and have written that their most creative ideas or most innovative ideas came to them in what we now refer to as the mind wandering mode. And that's daydreaming. And so Einstein, Jobs, Amos and Tversky, the fathers of behavioral
Psychology.
economics and the grandparents of neuroeconomics, they said that their best work was done when they were walking on campus together in nature. And so this daydreaming mode is when you have nothing specific, right? That you're thinking about. You're just letting your mind wander. And so to use Gen AI to improve creativity or to spark creativity needs to be also have alongside it that awareness and that knowledge that the innovation itself is likely not going to come from the AI alone.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
However, I will say when it comes to the fear of the blank page or, you're just starting out, not really sure where to go, Gen AI is a great place for sparking creativity in that way because it can generate a lot of ideas quickly. Um, so However, there have been some other interesting findings in creativity as well, from some other researchers. And excuse me, what they found, this was with Dr. I want to make sure I get their name right. Yes, Dr. Johnson and their colleagues. So, what was really interesting, or no, sorry, this is Doshi and Hauser in Science Advances. So, basically what they found, they had people do a short creative writing task. Some of these folks were very creative, some of them not so much. They had variable backgrounds and variable writing skills. And what they found is that when groups had access or the individuals had access to Gen AI when writing stories, individually, these stories were more creative. However, overall, when you look at them at the whole, they actually were less diverse.
Interesting. Yeah, that actually touches on the next topic I want to talk about is using AI in collaborative thinking because I know there are some really interesting counterintuitive findings on that. And by the way, you mentioned what did you say? The walking. What kind of thinking did you had a really
The
nice
mind wandering mode
the
or
mind wandering mode. Yeah, it reminds me.
yes.
I years ago, I'm going to get the title of it wrong. I read a biography of the philosopher William James, and I think it was actually called A Random Stroll with William James by Jacques Barzun. And there was a bit, I always think of this, that, he was known for being quote unquote absent minded. And he took issue with that, William James did. He said, no, 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 I'm present minded somewhere else. But,
Exactly.
but so, and he too would take these walks and, and countless creative people, you may find that I've certainly found that in my own work. You take a walk, and that's when your mind is free and thoughts sort of float in, and you want to immediately, oh, I got to get back to my desk. Got a good idea. I don't want to lose that. Um, so I can see using Gen AI sort of as a blank canvas, just to throw things at, see what comes back. And everybody has their own process, or people may not have any process at all. It may be just sort of a Jackson Pollock throwing things at a canvas. although obviously there was a little bit more method to the madness there, but be that as it may. So I can very easily, any other thoughts on that? Any other findings as far as Gen AI and creativity? Have you found that again, the premise that we began with is that sometimes Gen AI replaces critical thinking. It replaces creativity. People lean on it to do things that they either can't do because they're not inherently creative, or to add to what it is they're doing, or whatever. Any other findings on that you care to share or you have at your disposal?
Really, I think that, um, the other really interesting finding was primarily just that in that same paper, they did find that the writing was more professional, but like as I said, it was less diverse as a whole, which suggests that there's sort of a narrowing due to the fact that Gen AI has been trained on the whole internet, which is going to be largely mainstream ideas. And so you need to be creative in your prompting for creativity. A little bit of a catch 22 there. If you want the Gen AI to give you things that are outside of the mainstream, otherwise it is going to give the most common answer.
Right. Well, it sort of in a way goes back to that whole cognitive
Metacognitive strategies or
thing where,
metacognition.
what you bring to it, or the process in wanting a creative output requires some creativity to get that creative output. But yeah,
Well,
I myself have used ChatGPT, Grok, etc., in a variety of ways to sort of, just be a little bit more creative, or, just to give me some ideas, not for an overarching piece or an AIX piece, but maybe a component of it. Give me some thoughts, maybe an example or several examples. And I may not necessarily use those examples, but it'll give me some ideas of other examples, or it may have a kernel of a good idea in the example or the examples. And it's like, okay, let me tweak that a little bit, et cetera. So it's really kind of a good, I use the word spark, and it really is that. It's not the flame itself. It's not the thing itself. It's a thing that ignites it, and
yeah, and
and
that's
and it helps you
exactly
in the
what
creation.
yeah, that's what exactly what basically the researchers found in this creative writing task is that they call it a springboard for creativity. It's a great springboard, but not necessarily going to give you the most creative overall product, right? But great
Yeah,
springboard.
yeah. No, exactly. Um, I do want to at some point give a plug for this workshop we're developing called Play It Forward, and it uses purposeful play, so people can discover for themselves how AI could unlock creativity, can spark creativity, how it can sharpen their critical thinking. And part of it is inspired, and I think I mentioned this to you, the Bauhaus. In the 20s, there was an instructor whose first class he would challenge them. And, you'd have in this class um, budding architects, painters, glass blowers, a whole range of artists, different types of artists. And he challenged them, and he'd hand out pieces of paper to each, and he'd say, okay, I want you to create something from this paper. And then he'd come back and he'd leave. He'd come back an hour later, and he'd see all these amazing things created from paper, airplanes, or a cathedral. And then he'd sort of look, not terribly impressed. Then he'd see somebody just fold the paper and leave it there like a tent or a teepee. And he'd hold it up. Ah, this is brilliant because this makes optimal use of the tensile strength and the inherent properties of paper. You're not going to be able to use paper to get a plane airborne. You're not going to be able to create a cathedral out of paper, but this is a proper use of paper. So, it sort of gave people, it unlocked something in people, gave them a different way of thinking. So I kind of want to bring that approach to the workshop so people can discover for themselves how they can use AI in those ways. But one of the things I really wanted to talk to you about, because we had a call leading up to this to prepare for this, um, you shared with me something that was really kind of fascinating. AI used in group settings, and researchers have found that it can actually reduce creativity and increase groupthink. I mean, you already mentioned that when you want to use AI for creativity, it sort of, pushes you to some sort of mean and some sort of general, response. So your creativity is creative within a certain range, which sort of undermines the very essence or nature of creativity. So tell me what you found there. That's really kind of interesting.
Yeah, and I will caveat this as well, there has been mixed findings. It is uh the effects of Gen AI in group collaboration can vary based on how the AI is implemented. However, if it's implemented very intentionally in a specific way for that project, that's one thing. However, when just offered to use Gen AI in collaborative work, what Johnson and their colleagues found in an article published earlier this year was that it increased groupthink by allowing the dominant perspectives to sort of uh, push themselves more to the forefront, and it reduced dissension from that. And part of that's because of its sycophancy, that the most dominant ideas from the group are going to be the ones that the AI recognizes as the ones that are most accepted. And so it's going to follow with those. And so, really, when you have Gen AI as a starting point, the discussion will often shift from what else could we do to which one of these things should we do out of these available that it's offered as an output. And so if you treat Gen AI as neutral or objective rather than something to be questioned and deliberately challenged and sparred with, um, the Gen AI will make it harder to avoid groupthink because of a lack of questioning. So it's not necessarily causing groupthink, but it can quietly accelerate that process, I would
Yeah.
say, um, by making consensus easier in a group, really, by limiting options and things like that. And so I found that incredibly interesting and a little bit alarming.
Yeah, it's interesting. What I sometimes do is I'll use multiple LLMs and compare the results. Um, because each one of them have a little bit of a different take, a little bit of a different flavor. And then I make a decision, for myself, where then I'll blend them. I'm actually
Right.
working on a piece, which is just sort of a fun piece, but it also gets back to that spirit of play. You can have some fun with this stuff. And if it's sort of purposeful, you can actually learn some things. So what I want to do is I'm challenging Grok and Gemini and Copilot and Chat and Claude, etc. If I'm missing any LLMs, my apologies. Don't take offense. Um, I'm challenging them to create a Rodney Dangerfield joke. And I reduced Rodney Dangerfield's jokes to a formula because his jokes are uniquely formulaic. And I
Yes.
reduce it to a formula, and I'm giving them each a scenario. And I want to see which ones come up with what I think are the funniest jokes. And I've actually done that. And then what I'm in the process of doing, I haven't finished this. So each gave me 5 jokes. So I take Grok's 5 jokes and I challenged chat. I said, well, here's what Grok came up with, chat. Why are yours better?
You're pitting them against each other.
Yes, I'm pitting them against each other. And
Clever.
what's kind of interesting about it is that the different, it's almost like you seeing the different personas because some of them are a little bit more collegial in their responses than others. Some are a little bit more competitive and edgy and disparaging. And it's really kind of an interesting process. But my point is that, in the collaboration process, I'm sure there are some exercises where, you have a particular challenge or you're dealing with a particular project or thing, and you have a team, maybe use the different LLMs, and you can share what you came back with, and that iterative process may improve that collaboration to the extent that you're broadening rather than narrowing the range of options and through that contentious process. I think collaboration inherently, uh, even if you're polite and collegial, is contentious because they're competing ideas. May the best ideas win, but ultimately it's inherently and unavoidably contentious. So I think you actually need to encourage and invite that element
No,
into it.
I love that idea, and that's it's not exactly what the, like, researchers had put in their recommendations, but it's pretty in line with it, which is, they recommended specifically alternating sessions with or without the Gen AI for the group, particularly starting with a session without it, if possible, and then bring it in and alternate sessions of working on the project with or without it, so that things that it comes up with are not always going to be the central driving force.
Right.
And it also, of course, encourages you, and um, the authors also encouraged, challenging the AI, things like that. I think your method of challenging the AIs against each other is an even maybe better version of that. However, of course, you still want the human oversight. But yeah, I think that uh,
But there's
yeah,
another problem
yeah,
that I think crops up, and it may not be in structured collaboration, but it could rear its head, if you will, um, in teams. So, for instance, let's say you're all working on a particular project. Each of you may have a different skill set. You may come at it from different
sure.
perspectives. Um, some may actually use AI in whatever it is they're contributing to it, and they
Uh-huh.
may not be forthcoming about that. And what winds up happening, because I've seen this, where people who really don't have those skills produce work that sort of encroaches on the specialties of other people. And they really not earn that. It's just sort of acquired in sort of an artificial way. And if I can see that really present, causing some dissension and creating a not terribly productive dynamic in any kind of group activity or collaboration. So, in a weird, it goes back to this idea, I suppose, that we stated at the outset. It's not AI that's going to take your job. Or somebody with AI who's going to take your job, but the person who's able to use it more effectively. But there's also an issue if somebody's using it particularly effectively in a way that's sort of outside their area of expertise, where it does impinge or encroach on somebody else's, it really can undermine that esprit de corps that's important, for collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you bring up a good point. As much as AI, these Gen AI tools are a great way to improve productivity and efficiency for individuals, when it comes to collaboration, it does become a lot more complex. And I think that leaders of teams really need to, number one, make sure that they're trained they train their teams or have their teams do training to understand how LLMs work, for one thing, because I think that knowledge informs how people interact with them and how much confidence they have in them. Um, as well as in being clear about what the guidelines for use are. So when they can and cannot use it for work, as well as trying to make a open space for questions and ideas about AI and how it can be used in workflows to be an open and ongoing conversation.
Yeah, I think it's a leadership issue. We're going to be having a conversation after this podcast with Carolyn Friedman, who's also been on the podcast before. She's now doing some work with the uh, ad. I, I forget the name of the group. They're based in the UK, Adaptivist Group. And I've had one of their lead researchers on as well. And they just came out with a report. One of the interesting findings is this disconnect largely because of Gen AI between leaders and teams. I'm going to unpack that when Carolyn is on the pod. I don't know exactly what they found there, but and I can see that, and I really think it's going to be real important for team leaders to make sure that people are in their lanes. It's a difficult balancing act because to tell people, "Hey, stay in your lane," can be kind of restrictive, constraining, and you can see people chafing, right?
Sure.
Um, but by the same token, you need to be real careful about people who are, stepping over lines, et cetera. So that's going to be an increasingly delicate issue, I think, going forward.
Yeah. And I would say that this is where soft skills are going to become incredibly important. Being able to communicate openly and effectively, having that social acuity to speak to diverse groups, diverse individuals, and working with diverse and cross functional teams that are increasingly global. These soft skills will become more important, not just in leadership, but also in working as an active user of Gen AI.
Yeah, no, for sure. And again, going back to the workshop I mentioned, one of the central ideas there is that um, Gen AI, agentic AI, is causing a lot of anxiety, a lot of confusion, a lot of
Yeah,
uncertainty because people are asking, "Oh, will I have a job in a year?" And it's not a question that's easily answered. And HR is fielding that question. They don't really have uh, an answer
no,
for it. And really, it's only an answer that the person asking the question could answer, because ultimately, whether or not you have a job will depend on the skills that you develop. And we're talking about these skills. We're talking about creativity, critical thinking, the ability to collaborate, these soft skills that you
absolutely.
mentioned. So to cultivate all of these things, and by the way, these aren't new things.
No,
These are age old things. It's just that they now need to be tailored and adapted to this world of AI augmented work. So skills and these soft skills are going to be ultimately the way you're going to be able to exercise some agency and be able to
absolutely.
answer that question. You can't fully answer that question, but at least you can have some sort of impact. You can have some sort of say in whether or not you're going to have a job. And you may not have a job, but in a year's time, because circumstances. Uh,
Sure.
but but cultivating those skills will ensure that you have a career.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You
You know,
said it perfectly. And like I said, yeah, those soft skills I think for a long time were ignored and by a lot of folks in that increasing productivity, Western speed up world must be more and more productive. But I think we're gonna see a bit of a turnaround here where it's well now Gen AI can help anyone produce the work, be productive. So those soft skills are just gonna become very crucial to ensuring you have a career.
Exactly, and differentiate yourself. Alice, again, thank you. I think that wraps
Thank
our
you, Charles.
second. And again, we've had several conversations with some in the new year. Really looking forward to that. Obviously, I'm looking forward to the next new hair color you bring to the podcast. Now you have us all on the edge of our seat.
Oh gosh.
You know,
Now
I
I
don't,
now
I
I have something I've committed to.
exactly, unfortunately, I don't have those range. Well, I guess I could if I, went that way,
Your
but
hair is light enough.
yeah, I
Come ever
guess.
down south, I'll come and give you a fun color, okay?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That
We'll
might
do the
work.
beard too.
Yeah. Well, you got to match.
You gotta.
Well, maybe not. Maybe not. That would be kind of an interesting two-tone look. You never
That
know.
could be, yeah.
Could be introducing a whole new thing. Anyway, Alice, thanks so much. I'm sure we'll be speaking, but happy holiday and all the best in the new year. And really looking forward to reconnecting on the X Factor.
Thank you so much, Charles. It's always a pleasure, and happy holidays to you as well. I am looking forward to what we have planned for the new year.
Excellent. Thanks.
Thanks so much.